Let's bring into the conversation now someone we rely on to help us make sense of these international matters. That's, of course, you know him, national security analyst and expert and retired Marine intelligence officer, Hal Kempfer. He joins me. Hal, good to see you here. It's somewhat difficult to know where to start with you because there is so much today. Let's start first, though, with Hegseth's trip there, visiting NATO headquarters in Brussels for the first time. Would you characterize Hegseth's style as speak softly and carry a big stick, or a bull in a china shop approach to the NATO alliance? How would you characterize it?
My impression was a little bit more of the latter. Definitely wasn't speaking softly. He was speaking very bluntly to them, although he seemed to have very cordial discussions from all reports away from the main table with the various different members. They said they were very frank, but they were very friendly from the reports that were given. So, but at the main table, he delivered a tough message. I mean, the two big things that came out of there was that whatever peace process comes out of this, that they shouldn't expect that Ukraine's going to go back to its pre-2014 borders. And certainly since this war began, that has been the strategic goal of Ukraine, not just to stop the Russians, but to push them back outside of the, push them back beyond not just where they are, but push them all the way out to regain all that Ukrainian territory. And then the other issue is, as you may recall, under the Biden administration, NATO had already agreed across the board that Ukraine was on an irreversible path to NATO membership. Well, it looked like he kind of reversed that today. Okay. He said, nope, that's not going to happen. We shouldn't expect that to happen. And he made a comment that there's no way that Putin would ever accept that, on, quote, God's green earth, unquote, which is another way of saying they just don't see it. Now, a number of experts have been very critical of that, saying, why are you saying that now before the negotiations have begun? These are things that you can talk about during the negotiations. And that's a good point. On the other hand, it might be to spur Putin into doing something. And there is that school of thought that you open up the door, you give them these things publicly, and then if he still balks, then you can always back it off. And I would point out one thing about the Trump administration is that I haven't seen a lack of interest in reversing themselves on something pretty quick. And I would point to the tariffs on Mexico and Canada as an example of that.
Hal, I just want to acknowledge and point out, because this is significant, and yes, elections have consequences when it comes to policy matters with regard to conflict. But two things, to your point that you noted: radical policy changes from the Biden administration. Remember, to your point, during the NATO summit in D.C. in July, there was a bridging proposal agreed to open up the conversation for Ukraine to eventually join NATO. We don't know when that was going to happen, but they were on that path. That rug was pulled under them just today by Pete Hegseth there in Brussels. So I thought that was also very interesting. But with regard to the freezing of the lines on the battlefield in place, it seems like Hegseth has now adopted that. And maybe to your point, as a negotiating tactic in public, that seems to be where the language is headed. And I can't imagine what Putin is hearing there in the Kremlin and how he is responding to a lot that was put on the table. Was it only put on the table today to jumpstart negotiations? To your point, will there be behind closed doors an opportunity to wield some leverage? Because a lot was put on the table today by Hegseth, Trump, and others.
I think what it is they're putting this on the table to get something going. I mean, up to this point, Putin has been reluctant to engage in any negotiations, peace negotiations, ceasefire negotiations. Despite some of his public comments to the contrary, nothing substantive has been done. President Trump reportedly had a very, almost hour-long discussion with Putin today. He said it was very constructive or very positive in terms of what was discussed. So there is some movement there, and you have to remember that President Trump campaigned consistently on ending the war in Ukraine, and he's been saying consistently he wants to stop the bloodshed, what he calls the loss of millions of lives across the board, and he's quoted some very large numbers. Some of the numbers he's quoted for Russia match what the Ukrainians are saying. Some of the numbers he's quoted on Ukrainian losses, I'm not quite sure where he gets that from. They seem a little bit higher than anything I've seen, but nonetheless, he brings up a good point, which is there is a daily slaughter going on, mostly on the Russian side, but there is a daily slaughter going on, and so he wants to stop the war, and so he's kind of moving forthrightly, putting the goal of stopping the war as soon as possible, probably ahead of the goal of the terms of how the war gets stopped. But I will tell you, and you heard it, and I'm not surprised. As you know, I've spent some time this last year in the Baltic states. I was not surprised to hear the Baltic defense minister coming out and talking about peace in our time. And frankly, I was expecting somebody to make an analogy towards Chamberlain at some point, with this, because there are similarities if you listen to it. And of course, another thing that Hegseth said, there won't be any U.S. forces as part of that peacekeeping presence, if you will, in Ukraine. And he was very unambiguous about that, which puts on the Europeans, of course.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask about that. Hegseth bringing up this idea of some type of international peacekeeping force once some type of settlement is agreed upon to kind of hold the line of contact in place. Who would that be? Is Poland going to do it? Are the Baltic states going to do it?
That's actually, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm just saying, who's going to do it? I wouldn't imagine Poland or the Baltic states would be keen on something like that.
It's interesting you bring that up. Well, first off, the Baltic states don't have a lot of excess military presence. They've actually got NATO brigades from other parts of NATO countries to bolster their physical presence just to secure their own border. So I don't expect that they would be, if they did anything, it'd be a very much token force, like maybe a battalion of 500 soldiers or something like that, but not a very robust force from the Baltic states. Other countries I could definitely see. Poland, of course, you mentioned. Germany, France, Britain would be high on the list. And then I would expect that there would be an attempt to try and get countries from Southern Europe, perhaps Spain, Italy would be a couple of countries that come to mind. Maybe I don't think Turkey would want to join in, but maybe Greece might want to put forces in there. But they also mentioned non-NATO, and I found that phrase particularly intriguing. Because I started thinking, well, which non-NATO countries might they be thinking of? Of course, as you know, this week, President Trump is meeting with Prime Minister Modi of India, and that is an immediate one that comes to mind, is the possibility of a fairly large Indian army presence that could be up there to act as peacekeepers. And Indian troops have acted as peacekeepers, peace enforcement troops, in a variety of roles in the past, so it's not a mission they're unfamiliar with. And then the possibility of looking even further afield, maybe looking to Southeast Asia, maybe looking at countries like, perhaps, and this is I'm just guessing, but looking at countries like maybe Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, maybe seeing if they could do something. When you get into, you're almost talking about UN peacekeeping. And when you talk about UN peacekeeping stuff, it really goes very far afield.
Yeah.
That's where you end up having Fijian troops on the border of Lebanon doing peacekeeping missions, which seems a little bit of a head scratcher. Although I will say the Fijian peacekeeping troops are extremely well trained, outstanding peacekeeping troops, some of the best in the world.
All right. Hal, I wanted to ask, though, about back to the negotiations. And we're talking about this still hypothetically, though it does seem like things are moving fast to that point here. And so I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But some of Hegseth's critics and Trump's critics have essentially said we're setting too many conditions pre-negotiation. I mean, before anyone has sat down at a table here. Some have even gone as far to say this is capitulating to Putin. This is a win for Putin. You and I have talked so much about what a victory for Ukraine would look like. With what Hegseth outlined today, is that it or not?
That is the big criticism, was that some of the things that he said sounded just like Vladimir Putin talking points. No NATO, stop at the current lines, or the 4 oblasts, if you will, that are currently largely, not completely, but largely occupied by Russian troops. Interestingly, in the background, almost completely missed, President Zelenskyy had talked about earlier that maybe there'd be an exchange of territory if Ukraine pulled out of the Kursk Oblast in Russia. that maybe Russia would pull out of some of the areas they occupy, and the Kremlin shot that down completely today. They said, nope, that's just not going to happen. So the Kremlin's taking very much a hard line, and the reality is, I think that Putin will listen to today, and it'll be wind in his sails. And what's interesting, if you actually look at the ground in Ukraine, so much has changed since the war started 3 years ago. First off, Ukraine has an advantage in tanks. They actually have more tanks on the ground than Russia, and Russia is running out of tanks. In terms of troops on the ground in Ukraine, again, Ukraine has a troop advantage. Oh, they've got huge manpower problems, don't get me wrong, but Russia has enormous manpower problems as well. And so, in a lot of these key metrics, battlefield metrics, where they are today, Ukraine versus Russia, if you will, the math has changed dramatically on that. And I would say if Putin pushes too hard, there's a possibility that the U.S. could kind of, spring back a little bit, if you will, and take a harder stance. And again, most would say don't ever throw that stuff out there as preconditions, particularly in NATO conference. Don't say that you're going to stop the accession of Ukraine to NATO. Don't talk about freezing the lines. Don't talk about the U.S. not participating. Use that in the negotiations, but there is a contrarian view that you throw that out there. Let Putin do whatever Putin does, kind of feel him out to see where he's going to go with that. And then if he starts to, again, take the stance that he's been taking, then you start taking things off the board. That's one way of negotiating. All right. I would have preferred if those things didn't get offered up front, but that's my personal view. But they did. So you just have to kind of, see how this is going to play out.
Yeah, and we do bring you on for your personal view because it is so insightful. Hal, we had mentioned about the path to NATO membership now somewhat being off the table, some type of international peacekeeping force when the war is over or a negotiated settlement is reached. Another major departure from the previous administration is just the pure fact that a phone call took place between the U.S. president and the Russian leader. All right, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, they got on the phone today. He also spoke with Zelensky, yes. But since February of 2022, U.S.-Russian relations have essentially stopped, paused, frozen in place because of the invasion itself. The last time a U.S. president spoke to Vladimir Putin and met him in person, that was in Geneva, Switzerland in the summer of 2021. That was well before the invasion between Biden and Putin. And now a phone call has taken place. Established lines of communication have been redrawn, so to speak, or reestablished, so to speak. So just that very fact is very significant that a phone call took place and an extension, a mutual extension of dueling invitations. No, you come to Moscow. No, you come to D.C., have been offered, have been put on the table. Trump to Putin, and Putin via his spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, to Washington, to Trump here. We're in a completely different phase now, I would argue, of this conflict here. I want to put this up. This is part of the Truth Social post from Trump announcing this. He said, I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. He says, we discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people and we, likewise, lost so many. We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. So, Hal, if you were working in the Trump White House and you were advising President Trump, would you have said take this phone call or not? Because remember, in the Biden administration, there was no communication. This is different from that. Is it going to work?
I think if you look at President Trump's history, he was going to have that phone call one way or the other. In fact, there was reports that he may have already had another phone call with Putin, which was kind of a little bit ambiguous. There was some walking back of that. But he's going to talk to he's going to talk to Putin. That's just all there is to it. Now, with that said, this is not the first communication certainly we've had with Russia since the start of the Ukrainian war. There's been a number of communications at the Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense level, at a variety of levels below Putin. There has been ongoing communications between the counterparts there, so that has not stopped. Although at one time it was noticeably paused for a period of time when tensions were particularly tough. But the other side too, and this is something that President Trump has brought up many times, is that Russia is a very well-armed nuclear nation, that they have a very big nuclear arsenal. And one thing that seems to weigh heavily on his mind is the fact that Russia is so well-armed. The other side too is more is coming out that Russia may have seriously been considering earlier in the war of using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I'm sure that whatever's coming out in the public, whatever's coming out in the classified realm is much more definitive in that regard. So that may be playing on President Trump's mind in terms of where this has to go. Part of the problem that they run into is if, for example, the Putin regime was to collapse, if there was, if it really got to the point where they were overthrown or something like that, what would Putin do? What would be his final last stand? And I'm sure their psychologists have looked at this and said, well, he might do this. Okay. And that probably weighs pretty heavily. And one thing that Donald Trump is he likes to read people. He sees all negotiations, and he certainly reads people more than he reads national interests, probably more as he reads people a lot closer. He reads national leaders probably closer. So he puts a lot of stock in that. So that may weigh more heavily on his mind than, say, certainly President Biden, who I think would look at national interests and international interests, regional interests, before he'd actually look at focusing on just the personalities involved.
Okay, it was also reported, though, I failed to mention this, that the U.S. Special Envoy for all of this, Steve Witkoff, while on the ground in Russia for, 6 or 7 hours, to get American teacher Mark Fogel back to the U.S., met with Putin. I don't know how long that was being reported, and that was significant in and of itself here. Also, Trump in the Oval Office today saying possibly a meeting might take place between the two in Saudi Arabia later this year. We'll just have to wait and see. Last point on this, Hal, we got to go. Are you concerned? Do you see where some of the critics of all of this are coming from, that the United States is giving away the farm, so to speak, so fast? That some type of official visit conferred upon Vladimir Putin to Washington during this war would be seen as a major propaganda win for Putin. Are you worried by that?
I am concerned. If they were to meet before the Ukrainian agreement is reached, I think that would be somewhat preemptive in terms of that. I would not like to see that. I would certainly like to see something that puts at least a ceasefire on the ground, some sort of agreement that the Ukrainians can agree to. Of course, one of the fears of the Ukrainians, and it's been kind of hovering out there, is that the U.S. and Russia get involved with this big discussion and not really involve the Ukrainians that much. And we kind of saw that certainly with Afghanistan, where under the Trump administration, they met with the Taliban, but didn't include the national government. And we saw how badly that went for the national government. So there is some fear of that the Ukrainians will get sidelined. Although with that, Vice President J.D. Vance is meeting with Zelensky this week, and hopefully there'll be a good discussion that comes out of that. There was also another discussion today at the same time, not at the same time, but same day. He's talking to Putin. He's talking to President Zelensky. The discussion with Secretary of Treasury Bessent went well, and also they finished up. Looks like this exchange that took place with Fogel, that they exchanged a Russian that we held, and in that, interestingly, Belarus released an American citizen and 2 Belarusians from their prison. Right. So it looks like there may have been more going on there than we knew. So there's, I kind of put it all in context. Okay. There's some good things that are happening, but there's a lot of concerns.
Yeah. All right. Hal, thanks so much. Can't thank you enough for all the insight you provide. And we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew.